Welcome to Nazir Fears.
Like, subscribe, share, and click that bell icon.
Whispers from the Walls. Olivia Waters had always been excited to move into her new home. It was an old Victorian-style house tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, its charm enhanced by the creaky wooden floors and the ornate details in every corner. It was everything she had ever wanted, a space she could call her own, full of history and character. The kind of home where she could finally start fresh after a long period of personal struggles. The first few days were perfect. She unpacked, arranged her belongings, and basked in the peaceful solitude of the house. But it wasn't long before things began to feel strange. It started with small things, little oddities she could dismiss as her imagination. The occasional creak in the floorboards, a door that seemed to close on its own, and the faint smell of something unfamiliar that would disappear when she tried to track it down. Nothing alarming at first, but then one night, she woke to hear something that made her skin crawl, a soft whisper, as though someone was speaking just outside her bedroom door. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her, but when the whisper came again, this time louder, and it sounded like it was coming from within the walls, her heart began to race. "Olivia!" Her name, spoken in a breathless voice, sent a shiver down her spine. She shot up in bed, the room dark and still. The house seemed to be holding its breath. She listened intently, but there was no more sound, just the silence of the night. Was it just the wind? She tried to reason with herself, but deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The whispers continued every night, growing louder and more distinct. Sometimes they would call her name, and sometimes they would speak in hushed tones, too quiet for her to make out the words. At first, they seemed random, but over time, the whispers grew more purposeful, more insistent. One evening, as the whispers grew louder, Olivia couldn't take it anymore. She decided to investigate. She crept out of her bed and followed the sound, her bare feet tapping softly against the hardwood floors. The whispers led her down the narrow hallway, and she found herself standing before a door that she hadn't noticed before. The door to a small room tucked away at the end of the hall. The door was old, its paint chipped and peeling, as if it hadn't been opened in years. Olivia's hand hovered over the doorknob, her heart hammering in her chest. The whispers seemed to be coming from behind the door now, clearer, more urgent. She turned the knob and slowly pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, and in the center of the room was an old rocking chair, slowly swaying back and forth, though there was no breeze. The sound of creaking wood filled the space, like something or someone was there. Olivia stepped inside, her breath shallow. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The whispers became clearer now, though the words were still indecipherable. They seemed to come from all directions, bouncing off the walls and reverberating in her mind. She walked deeper into the room, her eyes scanning the shadows. Then she saw it. At the far corner of the room, a crack ran along the wall. It was small, barely noticeable, but as she approached it, she felt a strange pull. Her hand reached for the crack, and when her fingers touched the rough edges, the whispers grew louder, as if they were coming from inside the wall itself. Before she could react, the wall suddenly shifted. The crack widened, and a hidden compartment opened, revealing something that made Olivia's blood run cold. An old, faded photograph, tattered at the edges. It showed a young girl, no older than 10, with wide, hollow eyes and a crooked smile that seemed far too unsettling for her age. Olivia's hand trembled as she picked up the photo. The whispers were now deafening, surrounding her, pressing in from every side. "Help us!" The voice was unmistakable now. It was the voice of a child, desperate and pleading. "You can hear us, can't you?" In a panic, Olivia stumbled back, dropping the photo to the floor. Her heart raced as she backed away from the wall, but as she turned to leave the room, she froze. Standing in the doorway was a figure, a small girl, no more than 10, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were the same as the ones in the photograph, dark, hollow, and filled with a deep sorrow that seemed to pierce right through Olivia's soul. The girl didn't speak. She just stood there, her eyes fixed on Olivia, as if waiting for her to do something, to understand. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, and the girl's form flickered, as though she were fading in and out of existence. The room seemed to pulse with an energy that was both oppressive and suffocating. The whispers grew louder, now a chorus of voices, all pleading with Olivia to help them. Suddenly the girl's voice cut through the cacophony, sharp and clear. "You must leave this house, or they will take you too." Terrified, Olivia bolted from the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran down the hallway, back to her bedroom, and slammed the door shut behind her. She collapsed onto her bed, gasping for breath. The room fell silent. The whispers stopped. For the first time since she had moved in, Olivia felt the weight of the house lift. The oppressive air was gone. The presence she had felt, gone. But even as she lay there, her mind racing with questions and fears, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not truly alone, that something in the walls was watching, waiting. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly dawn. And then, as if on cue, the whispers began again. Faint at first, but growing louder, coming from the walls. "Olivia!" The house was not finished with her yet. The vanishing roommate. Max Jennings was thrilled to have found a new apartment in the city. It was cheap, clean, and located in a quiet part of town, a perfect escape from the chaos of his college life. But what really sealed the deal for him was the roommate, Ryan, quiet, polite, and seemingly normal. They hit it off immediately during their first meeting, and Max felt like he had found a place to call home. The first few weeks went by without a hitch. They kept to themselves, living their separate lives, with only the occasional conversation in the kitchen or bathroom. Max had never been one for big social gatherings, and Ryan seemed content with that, too. But then, things began to feel off. Max started noticing small things that didn't quite add up. Ryan, who had always been polite and friendly, started to act a little strange. He became distant, often locking himself in his room for hours. When he did come out, his eyes looked hollow, his movements slow and deliberate. He seemed perpetually tired, though Max never saw him sleep. The oddest part was that Max had never heard Ryan leave the apartment. The door was always locked when Max came home, and Ryan's car was always parked in its spot. Max didn't think much of it at first. Maybe Ryan was going through something. Maybe he just needed his space. But then one night, things escalated. It was a Friday, and Max had stayed up late studying for an exam. He was in his room when he heard something, a soft scraping sound, followed by a strange, rhythmic tapping. The sound was coming from the hallway, just outside his door. Max froze, his heart racing. He had never heard anything like it before. It wasn't like the usual creaks of the old building. This was something deliberate, almost unnatural. He got up cautiously opened his door and peered out into the dimly lit hallway. The source of the sound was immediately apparent. Ryan was standing there staring at the wall, his fingers tapping against it in an odd pattern. "Ryan?" Max called softly. Ryan didn't respond. "Ryan, what are you doing?" Still, no answer. Ryan's head tilted slightly, his face expressionless, his eyes blank. It was as if he hadn't heard Max at all. Max stepped closer, a sense of dread crawling up his spine. He placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder, but the touch made Ryan flinch, as if waking from a trance. Ryan's eyes blinked rapidly, and he looked around as if he had no idea where he was. "Max?" Ryan finally said, his voice weak and distant. What time is it?" Max's stomach twisted. The entire interaction felt wrong, unnerving. "It's almost midnight. Are you okay?" Ryan blinked again, slowly, before offering a strained smile. Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, I guess. I'll go to bed now." Max nodded, though his unease didn't fade. Ryan didn't wait for another word. He simply turned and walked back to his room, closing the door behind him. The next day, Ryan was gone. Max woke up to find the apartment eerily quiet. Ryan's room, which had usually been locked, was wide open. Max hesitated, unsure whether he should check on him. But when he walked past the door, something caught his attention. A small piece of paper on the floor, partially hidden beneath the doorframe. Max picked it up. On it, in Ryan's shaky handwriting, were 3 words. "Don't trust me." A chill ran down Max's spine as he stood there, staring at the paper. What the hell was going on? He knocked on Ryan's door, but when there was no response, he opened it cautiously. The room was completely empty. No bed, no clothes, not even a trace that anyone had ever lived there. The closet was bare, and the drawers were open but empty. The only thing left behind was the faint smell of something metallic, something stale. Max felt his heart race. He ran to the front door only to find it locked. He fumbled with the keys, opened the door, and stepped out into the hallway. There, in the hallway mirror, he caught a glimpse of Ryan. Except this time, something was wrong. Ryan's reflection wasn't quite right. It was like he was staring at the wrong part of the room, his eyes fixed on nothing. Max whipped around, but Ryan was nowhere in sight. "Ryan!" Max shouted, his voice echoing through the empty apartment. But there was no answer. The apartment was silent once more. Max's hands shook as he closed the door and locked it. The walls seemed to close in on him. The feeling of unease was overwhelming. He checked his phone, but there were no messages, no missed calls from Ryan. He scrolled through his contacts. Nothing. The next day, Max returned home after class to find that Ryan's car was parked in the driveway again. Max's pulse quickened as he approached the apartment, but when he opened the door, he was met with an unsettling silence. The place was exactly as it had been the day before. Nothing had changed, except Ryan wasn't there. Max sat down on the couch, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan was somewhere, watching him, lurking just out of sight. Maybe he was just going crazy, or maybe something had happened to Ryan, something that Max couldn't understand. A few days later, Max's fears were confirmed. As he was leaving for class, he noticed something strange on the floor near the door. A small handwritten note, tucked under a stack of mail. It was from Ryan. "You should have never moved in. They'll come for you next." Max froze, his hand still on the doorknob. His mind raced, and panic set in. He looked around the apartment as if expecting Ryan to appear at any moment, but it was just him. alone. He couldn't stay here. Whatever was happening to Ryan, it was happening to him too. He grabbed his things and left the apartment, not daring to look back. The last time Max saw Ryan, he was standing in the hallway, staring at the wall. Now, it seemed, Ryan was gone, vanished, and Max had no idea whether he'd be the next one to disappear. The last call. Megan Foster was used to the late-night shifts at the hospital. Working as a nurse on the graveyard shift had its perks: less traffic, more downtime. But it also came with its own set of challenges. Most people were asleep, and the world outside was silent. But within the hospital's walls, it was never truly quiet. The beeping of machines, the murmurs of staff, the occasional cry of a patient, all of it formed the backdrop of her late-night world. One particularly quiet night, Megan was finishing up some paperwork in the nurse's station when the phone rang. It wasn't unusual for the phone to ring at odd hours, but the chill that ran down her spine when she picked it up was something new. She answered the phone as she always did. "Emergency room, Megan Foster speaking. How can I help you?" There was a long pause on the other end, and Megan glanced at the phone, wondering if there was a malfunction. But then, a voice came through, thin, raspy, and weak. "Help me! I'm scared." The voice was faint, as though coming from a great distance, but the words were clear enough. Megan's stomach twisted with a strange sense of unease. It sounded like the voice of an elderly person, but the tone, it was strained, desperate. "Who is this?" Megan asked, her voice steady, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "Help me! I can't breathe! Please!" The voice stopped abruptly, replaced by a harsh, coughing fit. Megan's fingers tightened around the phone, her pulse quickening. Was this a prank call? No, it didn't sound like one. It sounded like someone who was truly in distress. "Where are you?" Megan asked, her voice sharper now. "Tell me where you are. I'll send help." There was another long silence before the voice returned, whispering. "Room 213, please." The line went dead. Megan's heart skipped a beat as she stared at the receiver in disbelief. Room 213? That room hadn't been occupied for weeks. In fact, it was supposed to be empty, waiting for new patients. She couldn't understand why someone would call from there, or why they sounded so desperate, so real. She stood up quickly, instinctively moving toward the hallway. A sense of dread had settled over her, but she couldn't ignore the voice. She had to check it out. The hospital was eerily quiet as Megan walked down the long corridor, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. As she passed the nurse's station, she glanced at the clock. It was nearly 3 a.m. The halls were dark, with only the dim emergency lights casting faint shadows against the walls. When she reached room 213, she hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, the room beyond dark. She could hear nothing, no beeping machines, no rustling sheets. But she felt a nagging pull, an unexplainable urgency to open the door. With a deep breath, Megan pushed the door open, stepping inside. The room was completely still and at bay. First, she saw nothing unusual. The bed was empty, the sheets neatly tucked in. The only thing that seemed out of place was a small flickering light on the bedside table, a lamp that seemed to have been recently turned on. "Megan?" The voice echoed from the corner of the room, and Megan's blood ran cold. She spun around, her eyes widening in disbelief. Sitting in the corner of the room, in a chair that hadn't been there earlier, was a woman, pale, gaunt, and frail. Her face was obscured by matted hair, and her body was hunched over in a way that didn't look quite right. She looked at Megan with hollow eyes, eyes that seemed to stare through her, not at her. I need help, the woman whispered, her voice dry and cracked. They won't let me go. Megan's heart raced. She had no idea who this woman was. There had been no patient in room 213 recently, let alone someone who looked so sick. But the way the woman spoke, the desperation in her tone, sent a wave of unease over Megan. I'm going to get you some help, Megan stammered, but the woman's gaze never wavered. No, the woman croaked. They won't let you help me. Megan's eyes darted around the room, looking for anything that could explain what was happening. But everything seemed normal, except for the woman in the chair, and the voice on the phone, the voice that had told her to come here. Megan took a cautious step forward. Who are you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's lips twisted into a faint smile, and her eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. I'm the one who never left. I called you. I called because I need to warn you. Before Megan could respond, the woman suddenly stood up, her body jerking unnaturally. Her limbs twisted, and she let out a horrible, guttural scream, one that made Megan's blood freeze. The woman lurched toward her, her hands reaching out as if to grab her, her mouth open in a soundless scream. Megan stumbled backward, her legs giving out beneath her as she fell to the floor. Her head slammed into the edge of the bed, and the room spun around her. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the woman's voice, now clearer than ever. Don't answer the phone. It's never really me. The house at the edge of town. David Roberts had always been drawn to the quiet, secluded corners of the world. So when he moved to the small rural town of Harrowbrook, he felt at home. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and the pace of life was slow, easy. He quickly found a small house on the outskirts of town, cheap, with a beautiful view of the fields that stretched for miles. It seemed like the perfect place to escape, to reset. The house was old, a bit run down, but it had charm. There were rumors in town about the house, strange ones, about its past occupants. People had died there, or so the town's older residents said. But David was skeptical of local superstitions, and besides, the rent was affordable. He didn't mind the creaky floors or the drafty windows. He didn't even mind the strange chill that seemed to linger in the air, especially at night. It was a house, after all. A place to sleep. Nothing more. At first, the house felt just like any other. David spent his days unpacking and organizing, and his nights reading or watching TV. But soon enough, things started to change. Small things. Nothing that would make anyone else think twice. There were noises at night, whispers, faint but distinct, coming from the walls. Sometimes the sound of footsteps would echo through the empty halls when no one was there. David shrugged it off. The house was old. Houses made noises. But the whispers grew louder as time went on. At first, he thought it was just the wind, or the house settling. But when he started hearing his name being called, softly, almost as if it were a whisper in his ear, he couldn't ignore it anymore. David. It happened one evening as he was sitting in the living room reading a book. He heard it clearly, the whisper of his name, faint but unmistakable. He looked up, his heart racing, but the room was empty. The windows were shut, and the front door was locked. No one else could be there. David, the whisper came again, this time from the direction of the hallway. He stood up, his skin crawling. It wasn't just a whisper. It was like the house was calling to him, beckoning him toward something he wasn't sure he wanted to find. But curiosity got the better of him, and he slowly made his way toward the hallway. The lights flickered above him, casting long shadows along the walls. He stepped cautiously, his footsteps muffled on the old carpet, until he reached the narrow hallway that led to the bedrooms. He paused, listening. The whispering had stopped, but there was a new sound now. Soft, faint scratching, like nails on wood. David swallowed hard and pushed the bedroom door open, his breath caught in his throat. The room was empty, but the scratching sound persisted, coming from the far corner of the room, where an old wooden dresser stood. The air in the room felt heavier now, colder, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He walked closer, cautiously, and reached out to open the dresser drawers. As he touched the handle, the scratching stopped. But the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper, as though something was watching him. Without thinking, David pulled open the drawer. The moment he did, a blast of cold air hit him, and the room felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. Inside the drawer was a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. He picked it up with trembling hands and unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words scrawled in faded ink. "Leave while you can. It's not what it seems. Don't open the door. Don't." The air around him seemed to thicken, the oppressive silence almost deafening. David felt an icy chill run down his spine. He could feel something now, something watching him. He looked around, his heart pounding in his chest, but there was nothing there. Suddenly the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, heavy and deliberate. Someone, or something, was approaching. David turned quickly, but there was no one there. The house was silent again. That was when he heard it, the sound of the door creaking open. He whipped around, his breath catching in his throat. At the end of the hallway, the door to the basement, the one he had never dared open, was slowly swinging open. The door, the one the note warned him about. Something, or someone, was waiting for him down there. He could feel it. His body screamed at him to run, to leave, to get out of the house, but his feet wouldn't move. His eyes were drawn to the dark doorway at the end of the hall. Without thinking, he took a step toward it. The door opened wider, and he could just make out a shadow in the darkness below. A figure, standing at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, didn't even breathe, but David knew it was waiting for him. "David!" The whisper came again, this time louder, coming from the basement itself. The voice was no longer faint. It was clear and chilling, as if it were right behind him. David's heart thudded in his chest as he took a step back. But before he could turn to flee, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping him in the hallway. The whispering intensified, now a cacophony of voices, some pleading, others demanding. He turned, his pulse racing, and sprinted for the front door. But the air around him felt thick, like the house itself was closing in. The whispers grew louder, drowning out his thoughts, his screams. As he reached for the door handle, it twisted, and the door opened, only to reveal the same shadowy figure from the basement, now standing in front of him. Its face was shrouded in darkness, but David could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, its eyes boring into him. The whispering ceased, and in the silence, the figure finally spoke. "Stay. You belong to us now." The corpse in the attic. Rachel Stone had always been drawn to old houses. There was something comforting about their creaky floors, their faded wallpaper, the smell of history that lingered in the corners. When she found an apartment in an old Victorian building on the edge of town, she was thrilled. The rent was affordable, the space was spacious, and the building had character, everything she was looking for. But as soon as she stepped inside, a strange feeling washed over her. It was hard to describe, like the house was too quiet, as if it was holding its breath. She brushed the feeling aside. It was just an old building after all. The first few weeks went by smoothly. Rachel settled into her routine, work, errands, and spending her evenings curled up with a book or watching TV. The apartment was charming, with high ceilings and large windows that let in streams of natural light. But as time went on, she started to notice small things that didn't quite add up. It started with the sounds. At night, when she was lying in bed, she could hear faint noises from above. At first, she assumed it was the neighbors above her, people moving furniture, walking around, or perhaps a light fixture rattling in the wind. But the noises were different. They were more deliberate, as if someone were creeping around in the attic. One night, unable to ignore it any longer, Rachel decided to investigate. She grabbed a flashlight and made her way up the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The door to the attic was old, its wood warped with age, and it had a lock that hadn't been used in years. The smell of dust and mildew hit her as soon as she pushed the door open, and she turned on the flashlight, scanning the room. The attic was full of old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and the remains of what looked like an old storage space. But what caught her eye was something in the corner, an old trunk covered in dust, its lid slightly ajar. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she approached it, her breath shallow. She didn't know why, but something about the trunk felt wrong. She hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of her. Slowly she lifted the lid. What she saw inside made her blood run cold. A body. At first, she thought it was some sort of mannequin, an old, decayed figure wrapped in a tattered sheet. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized with a sickening lurch that it was no mannequin. It was a human body, preserved in some horrific way. The skin was shriveled, the face contorted in a grotesque expression of pain. The limbs were twisted, unnatural, as though the person had been forced into the trunk long after death. Rachel stumbled backward, her heart racing. She dropped the flashlight and it rolled across the floor, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She gasped for air, her legs trembling beneath her. What had she just found? The answer came quickly, though she wished it hadn't. A scrap of yellowed paper tucked into the folds of the sheet caught her eye. She grabbed it, her hands shaking as she unfolded it. If you are reading this, it means they have found me. They will find you too, and when they do, you will never leave this place. Rachel's stomach twisted as she read the words, her pulse quickening. The room felt colder now, the air thick with dread. It wasn't just a body, it was a warning for whoever came next. Panic surged through her. She had to get out of there. She turned to run, but as she reached for the door, she froze. The sounds from above had returned, but this time they were closer than ever. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and growing louder with each passing second. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The attic door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the small, dark room. She turned around in a frantic panic, her eyes wide, but there was no one there. The room was still empty, except for the corpse in the trunk. Then she heard a whisper, soft, like the rustling of a breeze. "Rachel." Her name, spoken in a voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She spun around, her flashlight darting from one corner to the other. The room was closing in on her. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the very walls of the house were alive, watching her, waiting for her next move. "Rachel, you should have left." The whisper grew louder, and as Rachel turned to the corner of the room, she saw them, the figures, pale, ghostly forms, standing motionless in the shadows. They were watching her, their eyes hollow and empty, their faces twisted in anguish. The floor creaked behind her. Rachel whipped around, her heart pounding in her chest. A man stood there, his face hidden in the shadows, his body draped in a tattered cloak. His presence was suffocating, cold, and familiar. He stepped forward, his face coming into view. But when she saw it, she screamed. It was the same face as the corpse in the trunk. The man smiled, a twisted, unnerving grin that stretched across his face. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Rachel screamed, stumbling backward, her body shaking uncontrollably. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was the man's face, inches from hers, his cold eyes filled with rage. And then there was only darkness. The sleep experiment. Jason Murphy had never been one to shy away from adventure. As a college student studying psychology, he was always looking for ways to test the boundaries of his own mind. So when he saw an advertisement for a sleep study that promised a substantial payout, he didn't think twice. The offer seemed too good to pass up. 3 weeks of observation, an all-expenses-paid stay at a state-of-the-art medical facility, and a chance to earn some extra cash. Jason was intrigued, but more than that, he was curious. What could they possibly be studying about sleep that would require such a long, intensive observation period? The facility was pristine, modern, sleek, and eerily quiet. It was situated on the outskirts of the city, a place where isolation could be guaranteed. Upon arrival, Jason was greeted by Dr. Phillips, the lead researcher for the experiment. The doctor was calm, professional, with an almost unsettling demeanor. He assured Jason that everything would be comfortable, that he would have his own room, and that he would be monitored through state-of-the-art equipment throughout the experiment. "I'm sure you'll find this fascinating," Dr. Phillips said with a thin smile. "We've been researching the deep phases of sleep and how it affects the brain, particularly in relation to memory consolidation and emotional regulation." Jason nodded, not fully understanding what Dr. Phillips meant, but excited to learn more. The first few nights went as expected. Jason slept in the sterile white room, hooked up to a series of monitors and electrodes that measured his brain activity, heart rate, and breathing patterns. Each morning, Dr. Phillips would check in on him, asking about his sleep, his dreams, and any unusual sensations. Jason reported nothing out of the ordinary, but soon things began to change. On the 4th night of the experiment, Jason had trouble falling asleep. It wasn't that he was particularly restless, it was just that something felt off. The room seemed too quiet, too still. The usual hum of the machines monitoring his vitals seemed louder in the silence, and Jason found himself staring at the ceiling, unable to relax. Around 2 a.m., Jason felt a strange sensation, a sudden shift in the air, cold, as though someone had opened a window. But the window was closed, the room was sealed, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving in the shadows, just outside his line of sight. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding. But when he turned to look, the room was empty. There was nothing unusual, but the feeling didn't go away. The next night, it happened again. Only this time, it wasn't just the cold air. Jason heard a soft, low murmur, like someone whispering just beyond the walls. He pulled the covers over his head, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere, around him, through the walls, inside his mind. He couldn't understand the words, but they felt invasive, oppressive. Jason's anxiety grew. He wasn't sure if the voices were real or if he was just hearing things. He hadn't felt this way before. On edge, paranoid, as though something was watching him. By the third night, the whispers had become clearer. The words were now intelligible, though distorted, as if they were being spoken by multiple voices at once, overlapping and tangled together. Sleep. You must sleep. Sleep, or you'll be lost. Jason jerked awake, his body drenched in sweat. The whispers were still echoing in his ears, even as he sat up in bed, panting. His heart raced, his mind reeling. He needed to tell Dr. Phillips, but the doctor had assured him that the experiment was safe. He had signed a contract, agreeing to the full 3 weeks. And besides, what if this was part of the experiment? What if it was all a test of his mental endurance? But he couldn't ignore it anymore. The next day, Jason went to Dr. Phillips with a sense of urgency. He explained what had been happening, how he could hear the whispers, how they seemed to be getting louder, more desperate. Dr. Phillips listened patiently, his face unreadable. When Jason finished, the doctor simply nodded and made a few notes on his clipboard. Jason, you're experiencing what we call sensory overload. It's not unusual in this environment, Dr. Phillips explained calmly. The equipment, the constant monitoring, it can affect your perception of reality. We've been testing the limits of the human mind, and it appears you're more sensitive than most. But don't worry, you're safe. Just focus on your rest. Jason didn't buy it. There was something wrong. He could feel it in his bones, but he couldn't leave, not without risking everything he had signed up for. So, he did what he could. He tried to sleep. That night, things escalated. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were voices, loud, demanding, echoing inside his head. He heard them calling his name, beckoning him deeper into the abyss. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in. The air grew thick, suffocating. Jason's breath came in shallow gasps as he reached for the buzzer beside his bed, but his hand couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. He was paralyzed. The voices grew louder. "You can't escape," they hissed. "You will never wake up." The lights flickered, and then there was nothing. The whispers stopped. The pressure in his chest lifted. Jason found himself staring at the ceiling again, breathing heavily. His body was drenched in sweat, but his mind was blank. He felt empty, numb, like he had just come out of a nightmare that he couldn't quite remember. The morning came, and Jason was barely able to drag himself out of bed. He stumbled into the hallway, his eyes bloodshot, his face pale. Dr. Phillips was waiting for him, as usual, clipboard in hand. "How did you sleep?" the doctor asked, his voice eerily calm. Jason started, but his voice cracked. He couldn't explain it. It was like a fog had descended over his mind, making it hard to think, to speak. "I think I need to leave. I can't stay here anymore." Dr. Phillips's expression didn't change. "You can't leave, Jason. Not yet. You haven't completed the experiment." Before Jason could respond, the doctor stepped forward, placing a cold hand on his shoulder. Jason froze. "You'll stay, or you'll never leave," Dr. Phillips said, his voice now completely devoid of emotion. Jason felt the world tilt beneath him. His vision blurred. The last thing he saw before everything went black was Dr. Phillips's smiling face. But it wasn't the doctor anymore. It was something else, something that had been waiting for him. And then there was only darkness. The Vanishing Hotel. Michael Harper had always enjoyed road trips. There was something about the freedom of the open road, the promise of new places to discover, that kept him driving from one town to the next. But after a long day of driving through a stretch of desolate highway, he found himself in need of a place to stay for the night. The small town he'd passed through was quiet, and he was exhausted, so he pulled into a nearby hotel that seemed to appear out of nowhere, sitting on the edge of a winding road, the only building for miles. It was an old Victorian-style hotel, with tall, dark windows and ivy creeping up its sides. The lights in the windows flickered faintly, casting a soft glow that seemed inviting amidst the darkness. Michael didn't think much of it. It looked like a quaint, if slightly run-down, establishment. The lobby was empty when he walked in, save for an elderly man behind the front desk. His face was weathered, his skin wrinkled, but his eyes were sharp as he looked up from the book he was reading. "Welcome," the man said with a raspy voice. "I have a room for you, room 318. Michael nodded and handed over his ID and payment, not bothering to ask about the place. He just wanted to sleep. The man handed him an old-fashioned brass key with the number 318 engraved on it. "The elevator's out of service, I'm afraid," the man added with a faint smile. "But the stairs are just over there." Michael thanked him and walked to the staircase. As he climbed the narrow, creaking stairs, he couldn't help but notice how quiet the hotel seemed. It wasn't just the lack of people. It was the absence of sound altogether. No music, no sounds of conversation or activity. Just silence. It felt almost like the hotel was frozen in time. When he reached the third floor, he found room 318 at the end of a long corridor. The door was old, the paint chipped, but it opened easily with the key. Inside, the room was surprisingly spacious. The furniture was antique but well preserved. A large king-sized bed covered in a faded quilt stood against one wall, and a heavy velvet curtain hung over the window, blocking the view of the dark night outside. Michael tossed his bag onto the bed and sat down, trying to relax. He was exhausted, and he knew he'd sleep well after such a long drive. But as he lay down, he noticed something odd. The bed seemed unusually soft, almost too soft. It sank beneath his weight more than it should, as though something beneath the mattress was pressing back against him. Curious, Michael lifted the mattress and peered underneath. There, to his shock, was a small, faded envelope resting on the floor. It was sealed with an old wax stamp, and the handwriting on the front of the envelope was elegant, almost too perfect. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling as he broke the seal and opened it. Inside, there was only one line written in fine script. "You shouldn't be here." A chill ran down his spine. Michael quickly shoved the envelope back under the mattress, dismissing it as a strange prank. He had to be tired, that was all. But as he tried to settle in for sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The quietness of the hotel was unsettling, and the longer he lay there, the more he felt like he wasn't alone in the room. A sound broke through the stillness, the faintest rustling, as though someone was moving in the hallway just outside his door. Michael sat up, his heart racing. He wasn't sure if he was imagining it or if someone had actually walked by. He waited in silence, listening. The footsteps stopped. Then, the door to his room creaked open. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He leaped out of bed, his heart pounding. But when he turned to the door, it was closed, just as he had left it. Confused, he walked over to the door and checked the lock. It was secure. So why did he feel like someone had entered his room? And why did the air feel so heavy now, like he was being watched? His unease grew as the night wore on. At some point, he must have fallen asleep, but his dreams were restless. He tossed and turned, waking intermittently to the sound of whispers just out of earshot, a sound that seemed to come from the corners of the room. He couldn't make out the words, but the voices were there, soft, urgent, as if calling him to listen. Suddenly he jolted awake to the sound of a loud bang. He sat up in bed, sweat dripping down his forehead. The room was still, but something felt off. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, but when he looked at it, the time on the screen didn't make sense. It read 3:18 a.m. "Must be a glitch," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. But when he glanced around the room again, it felt different, darker, more oppressive. That was when he realized he hadn't been hearing things. The door was now wide open, not just cracked, open. He stood frozen, staring at the dark hallway outside. And then, with a creeping horror, he realized that the hallway wasn't just empty. There were people standing in the shadows. They were all dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces pale, their eyes vacant, their movements stiff and unnatural. Michael could see them clearly now. They were lined up down the hall, staring at him. The hotel lobby, the stairs, everything was wrong. He wasn't in a regular hotel anymore. The figures in the hallway began to move, slowly, their eyes fixed on him as they stepped closer to the door. Michael's breath quickened, panic flooding his chest. Without thinking, he bolted out of the room, down the hall, past the eerie figures that never moved their eyes from him. He reached the stairs, his footsteps pounding on the creaky wood, and ran down the flights as fast as he could. But when he reached the lobby, his heart sank. The lobby was empty. The man behind the desk was gone, and the lights were dim, casting shadows across the room. The exit door was locked. Michael rushed to the door, pounding on it with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. He turned to look around. The entire hotel seemed to have vanished, as though it no longer existed in the world he knew. The walls shifted, the hallway stretching further and further, and the air grew colder. Then he saw it. At the far end of the room, in a corner he hadn't noticed before, a figure stood, its back turned toward him. As it turned around, Michael saw the same pale face, the same empty eyes. The figure raised a hand, pointing at him, and then it spoke in a low, echoing voice. "You shouldn't have stayed." The Silent Hospital. Anna Reynolds had never been one to believe in things that went bump in the night. As a nurse in a busy city hospital, she had seen things far scarier than any ghost story. Blood, trauma, death, those were the real horrors of the world, and they didn't need any supernatural embellishment. But one night, during a particularly grueling shift at the hospital, Anna's perspective on the unexplainable would change forever. It was nearly 3 a.m. when Anna entered the ward for her rounds. The hospital was mostly quiet at this hour, the usual bustle of nurses and doctors reduced to a few murmurs of distant conversations. Anna moved from room to room, checking on patients, adjusting IVs, and noting vital signs. But when she reached room 207, something felt different. The door was slightly ajar, which wasn't unusual. Sometimes patients would need help in the middle of the night, and the staff would leave the door open to hear them. What was strange, though, was the utter silence that seemed to emanate from within. There was no beeping from the machines, no rustling of bed sheets, no faint sounds of breathing, nothing. Anna's brow furrowed. She pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the machines on the bedside table. But what struck Anna immediately was the patient in the bed, an elderly woman, lying completely still, her eyes wide open. The woman's gaze was fixed on the ceiling, and she wasn't moving. Anna quickly approached the bed, checking the monitor. It wasn't displaying anything alarming. It showed a steady heartbeat and normal oxygen levels. But the woman's eyes, wide and unblinking, were unnerving. "Mrs. Clark?" Anna said gently, trying to wake her, but the woman didn't respond. She checked the woman's pulse. Steady. Then she moved to adjust the blanket. But as her hand brushed against the woman's wrist, she felt a sudden coldness, a coldness that went beyond the temperature of the room. It was unnatural, like a presence, something that didn't belong. Anna stepped back, unease settling in her stomach. There was something wrong about this room. Something wasn't right. The lights flickered overhead and the air in the room seemed to thicken. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible. It came from the woman on the bed. "Help me!" Anna froze. Her heart skipped a beat. The woman's lips hadn't moved, but the voice was unmistakable. Who are you?" Anna whispered, her voice shaky. The woman's unblinking eyes shifted slightly, just enough to show that she was aware of Anna's presence. But the voice came again, soft and desperate, as if it were coming from somewhere deep inside her. "I'm trapped. In here. I can't get out." The air grew colder still, and Anna's breath misted in front of her. The temperature in the room had dropped dramatically. The machines began to make faint, static noises, their once steady hums now distorting into irregular bursts of sound. The lights flickered more violently now, casting long, erratic shadows across the walls. "Please, help me," the voice whispered, closer now, almost in Anna's ear. "I've been here too long. I can't breathe." Anna stepped back again, feeling a growing sense of panic rising in her chest. Her mind raced. Was she imagining this? Could she be hallucinating from exhaustion? But no, this wasn't just in her head. She could feel it, the cold, the heaviness in the air, the sensation that something was desperately trying to reach out from the woman's body, something trapped inside. Without thinking, Anna rushed to the bedside table and grabbed the emergency call button. She pressed it repeatedly, but nothing happened. The room remained still, too still. "Please," the voice continued, now more frantic. "I can't leave. I'm still here." Anna stumbled backward, her body shaking as the walls seemed to close in around her. She turned and bolted out of the room, running down the corridor to the nurse's station. She couldn't explain it. Her mind was racing, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in that room. She grabbed the first nurse she saw and told her about what happened. Together they rushed back to room 207, but when they opened the door, the room was completely normal. The woman was still lying in the bed, her eyes closed. The monitors were working perfectly, showing her vitals as steady as ever. The coldness had vanished, and the lights were shining brightly. Anna felt a lump form in her throat. "But I heard her. She was awake. She was talking." The nurse looked at her with a confused expression. "Anna, Mrs. Clark passed away 2 days ago. We've been waiting for her body to be removed." Anna's stomach dropped. Her mind reeled. She looked back at the bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw the woman's peaceful face, now as lifeless as any corpse should be. But the whispers, the voice, still echoed in her mind, like a lingering presence that wouldn't leave. Later that night, Anna went back to the room alone. The hospital was quieter now, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to know more. She walked back down the sterile hallway to room 207. The door was still open. As she entered the room, she noticed something different. On the nightstand beside the bed was a small photo frame. It was a picture of the woman when she was younger, standing with a man and a child, her family. But the photo wasn't what caught Anna's attention. What made her blood run cold was the faintest writing on the back of the frame, written in what looked like a child's hand. "I never got to say goodbye." Anna's breath caught in her throat. She slowly turned toward the bed, her eyes widening as she saw the woman's eyes, still open, still unblinking, staring at her. And then a whisper, once again, filled the room. "Thank you for hearing me." The room was silent again. The room with no door. Emily Parker was no stranger to strange occurrences. As a seasoned journalist with a focus on paranormal investigations, she had experienced her fair share of eerie situations. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared her for the case that would change her life. It all began when Emily was hired by a local historical society to write about a centuries-old mansion on the edge of town, a place that had long been abandoned and left to decay. The mansion was a relic of the past, and though it had been the subject of many ghost stories, it had never attracted much attention, until now. The society was interested in preserving what little remained of the house and wanted Emily to write a feature piece on its history and potential. She arrived at the mansion one crisp autumn afternoon, her camera bag slung over her shoulder, ready to document the crumbling structure. The mansion had an eerie beauty to it, with ivy creeping up the sides and the faint scent of mildew in the air. The moment she stepped inside, she was struck by the silence. It was so thick, so oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Emily took a few photos, walking through the large, dust-covered rooms, trying to get a feel for the place. The mansion had a grand staircase, a massive chandelier, and rooms filled with antique furniture long forgotten. But there was something strange about the house, a sensation that she couldn't quite shake. As she explored further, Emily came across a door at the far end of a long hallway. It was unlike any door she had seen before. It was solid wood, old and intricate. But what struck her most was that there was no handle, no keyhole, no way to open it. Curiosity tugged at her. She tried pushing the door, pulling it, but it didn't budge. There was no indication of a way to access whatever lay behind it. She moved around it, looking for any signs of a hidden latch or trick mechanism, but there was nothing. Just a door with no way to open it. She stood there for several minutes, contemplating whether to leave, but something urged her to stay. The silence in the house seemed to grow louder, pressing against her like an invisible force. She knew she had to figure out what was behind that door. There was a compulsion she couldn't explain, a feeling that she had been drawn to this very moment. After several minutes of frustration, she gave up and walked away, but she couldn't shake the thought of that door. It haunted her as she moved through the house, taking pictures of the remaining rooms. The further she explored, the more she became aware of a strange energy in the house, an energy that felt off, like she was being watched. But every time she turned around, no one was there. It was only as the evening light began to fade that she decided to leave. Her car was parked outside, and the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. But before she could step out of the front door, she felt it again, that pull, that need to go back to the door. Without even thinking, Emily found herself walking down the hallway again, her footsteps echoing in the empty house. She reached the door and stopped. It was still there, standing silent and ominous, like a black hole in the middle of the hallway. This time, something was different. As she stood in front of it, she noticed a faint glow emanating from beneath the door. It was a soft, pulsating light, as though something was alive on the other side. Her heart raced, and before she could think twice, her hand was on the door. To her surprise, the door opened easily this time, as if it had been waiting for her. The room behind it was unlike any room she had expected. It wasn't full of dust or decay. It was pristine, as if it had been untouched for centuries. The walls were lined with ornate wallpaper, the floor covered in a plush carpet. In the center of the room, there was an old wooden chair facing a wall that seemed to stretch on forever. The room itself was small, but its proportions felt wrong, too wide, too deep, as if it extended beyond the physical dimensions of the mansion. Emily stepped inside, her feet falling heavily on the soft carpet. As she walked deeper into the room, she felt the temperature drop. The chill was unbearable, and her breath misted in front of her. She looked around, her camera ready, but something in the room felt off, unnatural. It was as if the room itself was alive, breathing, watching her every move. She turned her gaze toward the wall where the chair was facing, but when she looked closer, she realized it wasn't a wall at all. It was a mirror, a massive floor-to-ceiling mirror, cracked and warped, reflecting nothing but darkness. As she stared into it, she began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as though the mirror wasn't just reflecting her image, it was pulling her in, drawing her closer to something dark. Suddenly a voice broke the silence. It was soft, almost like a whisper, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't be here." The words sent a shock through her body. Her hands trembled as she reached for her camera, but before she could take another step, she felt a cold hand wrap around her wrist. She whipped around, her heart hammering in her chest. There was nothing behind her, but the grip on her wrist tightened. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The room seemed to spin around her. The air thickened, suffocating her as she felt herself being pulled toward the mirror. Her feet couldn't move, her body frozen in place. The mirror was no longer reflecting the room. It was reflecting something else, something that was not her. A figure, shadowy and indistinct, stood in the center of the mirror, its features unclear but its eyes locked on hers. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. "It's too late now," the voice whispered again, louder, more urgent this time. With all her strength, Emily wrenched herself free from the unseen force pulling her into the mirror. She stumbled backward, falling to the floor. But the room remained unchanged. The figure in the mirror was gone. The door was closed again. Gasping for air, Emily scrambled to her feet, not daring to look back at the mirror. She ran out of the room, down the hallway, and out of the mansion, not stopping until she was in her car, driving away, the mansion fading in her rearview mirror. The door behind her would remain locked for another 100 years. But Emily knew what she had seen. She had opened a door that should have remained shut, and now something was following her.